Hello, my name is Jake, and this is TANDEMKROSS, making good guns great. The Smith & Wesson Victory pistol is a fantastic little gun. It has a good feel and shoots great. However, with some upgrades from TANDEMKROSS, the Victory can be a really great race gun for competition shooting and speed challenges. One great TANDEMKROSS upgrade is the Victory trigger. Our trigger is different from the factory trigger in a few key ways. First, it has a flat face. A trigger with a flat face improves trigger feel and lets the operator know if they're pulling from one side or the other right away. The aggressive texture on the trigger improves the grip and repeatability of the trigger pull. In the heat of the moment of a speed competition, keeping your finger on the trigger in the same spot helps tremendously. We've added both pre-travel and over-travel screws for the adjustment of the trigger. This allows the trigger to be adjusted to the shortest amount of trigger movement. This will help improve the overall speed between shots and gives the trigger a really nice feel. The Victory trigger also lightens the trigger pull. A lighter trigger is what a lot of competitors are asking for. These combinations of great features, along with the slick look of the TANDEMKROSS Victory trigger, make it an excellent upgrade choice. Now let's go through the installation of the trigger in the Smith & Wesson pistol. Before we begin, we ensure that the gun is safe and that there's no ammo around the work surface. The tools that you'll need are a pick or a paper clip, a parts tray, a 3/32 punch, a 3/32 Allen key, an 1/8" Allen key, and if you plan to use the pre- and over-travel screws, some Loctite. It's also helpful to have a gun vise to hold the gun in position while you work. If you don't have a gun vise, I'll show you a trick later with a C-clamp that you can use. Before I begin to remove the trigger, I want to show the trigger pull weight for a good before and after moment. Here's a trigger pull before we install the TANDEMKROSS Victory trigger. Notice the amount of pre-travel that you have in the trigger. And if you also move the trigger side to side, you'll notice that it has a fair amount of side-to-side play. This is normal in the factory trigger. So let's do that pull test one more time. I'm getting about a 4-pound trigger. Let's start by removing the barrel. Take your 1/8" Allen wrench and undo the retaining bolt and pull the barrel off the grip frame. Next, let's remove the right grip panel. Take your 3/32 Allen key and remove the screws holding the grip in place from the right side. As the grip panel starts to come free from the gun, you'll notice that it's under a little spring tension. The magazine release and spring are underneath this right side, so be careful not to lose those. Remove the magazine release and spring and set those alongside with your screws. On the right side of the gun, you'll see the magazine safety. To remove the magazine safety, simply push up on the bar so that it comes out of the bottom of the frame. Then you can twist it 90 degrees and pull it out of the top of the frame. Take care not to bend your trigger disconnect bar. If you prefer to leave this part out when you reassemble the gun, it will remove the magazine safety feature and allow the gun to fire without a magazine installed. This is up for you to decide. We often run our competition guns without a magazine safety when possible. Now let's remove the left grip panel. Using our Allen key, we remove the screws and the panel will lift right out. Take care to watch how the bolt stop comes out of the gun. There is a little spring attached to the bolt stop that must be reinstalled into a hole in the frame. I'll demonstrate how to put this back on when we reassemble. For now, set this part aside with the screws. Next, we want to decock the hammer. With the safety off, pull the trigger, but make sure that your fingers are clear of the hammer when you do this. Now we want to remove the clip and detent spring from the hammer pin. Taking a pick or similar, pry up on the retainer clip and it'll pop up out of this recess in the frame. You'll want to set this part aside, and we're going to install this later when we reassemble. Now it would be beneficial to have a vise. If you don't have a vise, you can use a C-clamp on the bottom of your gun like this, and it'll allow the gun to stand on its own. I use this trick a lot, and it helps me have that third hand that I need to put small parts in. Now that we have the gun being securely held upright, we can now remove the hammer pin. When you go to remove the hammer pin, you'll notice that there is no pressure or tension on the hammer when it is rotated forward. You're going to want to remember this because this is the angle that we're going to have to put the hammer back in when we reinstall it. If you push gently on the hammer pin, it should come right out of the gun. You may need a punch to push it the rest of the way through. Here's your hammer pin. Your hammer. And the safety. Notice how the sear is positioned in the disconnect bar. This is important to notice because we need to get it back into this position when we reassemble. For now, press forward on the sear and lift the trigger disconnect bar off the sear completely. The trigger disconnect bar will rotate toward the front of the gun. Rotate it all the way forward, and this will release pressure on the trigger spring, which holds the trigger pin in place. The trigger disconnect bar rotated all the way forward, you can take your punch and slide the trigger pin out of the trigger. With the trigger pin now removed, you can easily lift the entire trigger mechanism directly out of the frame. Remove the trigger and the trigger spring and set these aside. We're now ready to reassemble and do the trigger install. To install the TANDEMKROSS trigger, we actually need to install all the other components first, and then the trigger will go in last. Taking the trigger disconnect bar, slide it over the sear as you rotate the sear forward. If you remember how we had the sear position earlier, we want to put the sear back into that position so that it's held onto the trigger bar. Next, we're going to take the safety and set the safety down into the frame. But the sear is going to fit right into this notch in the safety. So we're going to rotate the sear forward and hold down on the safety while the sear is held tightly in this notch. So rotate the sear forward and it will lock into the notch in the safety. Once you have it in that position, hold down, put downward pressure on the safety, and take your hammer with the tail facing toward the back, and we're just going to drop the hammer down into the top of the grip, like that. Now take your hammer pin and begin to push it through, putting slight downward pressure on the hammer, and the pin will line up and go straight through. Now you can remove your gun from the C-clamp or your vise, and we're going to reinstall the retainer clip. We simply drop the retainer clip over the pin and then work it counterclockwise back into the slot. Now on to the trigger itself. If you're planning on using the pre- and over-travel screws, which is optional, you'll want to start them into the trigger at this point. The short screw goes into the top of the trigger here, and the long screw goes into the bottom of the trigger here. Getting these close to position will make your life a lot easier when you go to adjust them later. Insert the screw so that it's just flush with the surface of the trigger. The nylon tip screw goes in the bottom, and you can put that in so that it's just flush with the face of the trigger. Now, from the left side of the gun, with the trigger facing like this, insert it into the grip through the frame and lift the trigger disconnect bar and hook the trigger disconnect bar over the top of the trigger. Just like that. Next, take the spring and detent that are included in your kit and put them together. Now, place this into the hole in the top of the trigger, underneath the tab that's on the disconnect bar. This can be a little bit tricky, so have some patience and take your time. To keep this from flying out after you've got it installed, press forward on the back of the trigger toward the front of the gun here, and that will keep it in place until you can get the trigger pin in. When the plunger is correctly installed in the trigger bar, it will look like this. I've managed to get the plunger and spring underneath this arm on the trigger bar. Now hold the trigger in place while I get the trigger pin, and working from right to left, I want to put the pin into the frame and start it into the trigger. And put the trigger pin into the trigger just up until the cutout in the side of the trigger. You'll see a gap between the trigger and the left side of the frame. The bushing that we provided in the kit slides down into that gap and into position so that the pin can go through the side of this bushing. So you want to drop this in and maneuver it into position. It's helpful here to use a pick or a paper clip to position the bushing just right. Once it's lined up, press the trigger pin the rest of the way. The bushing, when properly positioned, will stick out just beyond the frame just a little bit, and the hole will line up with the trigger pin hole here. Now we're going to reinstall the left grip panel. Take the bolt stop and locate the small hole in the frame for the spring. Ensure that the tip of the spring here goes into this hole and pop the bolt stop into the frame. Pressing down on the bolt stop here will help you keep it in place while you put the grip panel on and tighten the screws. Now we're going to install the right side. If you want to reinstall the mag safety, you would just reverse the operation that we did earlier. You would insert it through the frame here and then back down into the grip here. I'm going to leave this out for my installation. Next, take your mag release and put it into the frame. Your mag release spring goes into the mag release. And then press your right grip panel down on and install the screws. The last thing we do is reinstall the bolt and barrel. Now that we have the gun back together, we can do a dry fire and start to adjust the pre-travel and over-travel screws. If you're going to adjust your pre-travel and your over-travel screw, we highly recommend using Loctite on the set screws to keep them from moving around on you. You want to apply this before you go ahead and try to set the pre-travel and over-travel. Starting with pre-travel, turn the set screw clockwise until almost all of the take-up in the trigger is removed. Then dry fire the gun while continuing to hold the trigger down. Cock the hammer and slowly let up the trigger. You'll feel and hear the trigger reset. If you don't feel this reset, you have over-adjusted the pre-travel. Turn the set screw counterclockwise and repeat the process until you have a trigger set to where it functions each time. A word of caution, it's easy to over-adjust the pre-travel. It can be set so close that once the gun gets out in the heat or in the dirt and grit, it can prevent it from firing. Our recommendation is to leave a little bit of pre-travel in the trigger so that heat and dirt won't affect the trigger. Now let's set the pre-travel. Now to set over travel. Cock the hammer and pull the trigger, watching where the break happens. You want to adjust the over travel screw so that it stops the rearward movement of the trigger just after the break happens. Adjust the screw and pull the trigger, keeping it held down and recocking the hammer, letting up slowly to ensure a clean reset. It's possible to adjust the over travel so that the trigger won't break. To prevent this, leave some over travel in the trigger. Now let's test the new trigger pull weight and see how it performs against the original. So that's a pretty significant improvement. You can see there's very little trigger pre-travel now, and there's some side-to-side movement, but that's normal in this trigger design. I hope that this has been a helpful video and that you enjoy your TANDEMKROSS Victory trigger. You can find more upgrades for your Smith & Wesson Victory pistol on our website at www.tandemkross.com. My name is Jake, and this is TANDEMKROSS, making good guns great.